Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Critical Conservative. My name is Andrew Lake, and I'm going to be your host today on the second ever podcast episode for the Critical Conservative series. You know, we had a lot of fun recording that first podcast episode, and apparently you guys liked it as well. After the first 2 days of it being available on both YouTube and at our website, thecriticalconservative.com, we had over 150 views/listens collectively. It was a lot of support that we had coming from the community. We're quite grateful for that. We also received a lot of criticism, constructive criticism back from you guys. Things such as being a little bit more lively, less monotone. I have a tendency to do that. And also, I think the most important of the suggestions that we received, making our thumbnail look a little bit more beautiful. Hopefully you've appreciated the multiple arrows and the wow that we put in the thumbnail. We wanted to be a little bit more clickbaity, something that's a little bit more entertaining for you guys. So hopefully you like that. If you have stuff like that, these criticisms that you'd like to share with us, we are the Critical Conservative after all. We like criticisms, both of the ideology that we're trying to express and at the same time of the different manners in which we conduct this podcast. If you have suggestions for how we ought to go about recording, either for technical suggestions or where we should put it in terms of like if you want to see it on Apple Podcasts or others, just let us know. We'd be happy to receive those criticisms from you. And again, as always, if you disagree with something that I say, please let us know. We'll get into an interactive discussion with you guys on the subject. We always like to be able to see different points of view and try to express our intentions and our beliefs with you guys so that you can feel it, we can feel it, we can all be educated together. Additionally, if you'd like to contribute, say you want to host your own podcast or you want to write an article for our website, thecriticalconservative.com, just reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss that with you and see how we can advance our platform for your benefit so you can help get your voice out there. We like to hold disparate views. If you're a socialist, for example, who wants to write an article on socialism and where conservatives get it wrong, please feel free to do so. It's something that helps to educate everybody in the community, which means ultimately it can only help to advance our society. Now, we will be covering some rather touchy subjects in this particular episode. In fact, that's the reason why I've been more nervous with this episode than the previous one. Not only is it an issue of recording the podcast, but it's an issue of trying to learn how to phrase this correctly. And so we'd like to preface this particular episode by saying that we understand that most people, when they are advocating their certain positions and their beliefs, that they're coming from a position of true, genuine goodwill. We are not ascribing, and we don't hope to ascribe any malintent, any ill intent on anyone in any of these groups that we might be criticizing. Nor do we wish to kind of project a conceited, self-centered viewpoint of ourselves. We recognize that we're all imperfect. No one knows for sure what the best course of action is in any case. Really what we want to say is that we just want to put out a critique of the way in which people are advancing their causes. Kind of critique the PR element of how people might be able to interact and extend their ideology towards others, and at the same time critique a tiny bit of the ideology itself. So please don't feel like any of this is directed towards you. We don't intend it to. We really just want this to be a situation in which we can have a good discussion together. And so we'll start by talking about Trump's recent plan to reopen the economy, which is, if you've been able to listen to any political commentator or if you've had the opportunity to watch news, has been debated and discussed widely. It involves a series of phases that we'll see different communities go through. These phases being from almost as strict as the current phase that we're under now towards phase 3, the last phase being a gradual reopening of the economy in pretty much every aspect. And so to get through these phases, you have different gating criteria that you have to be able to satisfy. These gating criteria involve things such as reducing the number of influenza-like cases within your respective region or state, as well as reducing the number of COVID positive test results that happen within your state. Basically, they just want to see a downward trend of these particular issues within a given community, as well as ensuring that the hospital has a robust enough system that it can pick up and deal with the eventual spike that will happen after each phase is initiated. For example, as you go from phase 1 to phase 2, where you see a gradual reopening of the economy in even greater aspects, you're going to see a spike because more people are associating who hadn't had the virus with those who do, and so you're necessarily going to see a larger spike. The good news for us is that This means that the individuals really that are going to be going out and about are going to be individuals that should theoretically be able to recover well. In fact, this particular plan by Donald Trump looks a lot like Scenario 3 if you've watched the first episode of this podcast series. We talked about 3 different scenarios that could be enacted, the different types of quarantines that could be utilized to fight the COVID-19 outbreak. The first scenario being the one that we've been under for quite some time, which is to lock down pretty much everyone. The second scenario being that of kind of South Korea, testing everyone and isolating those that are infected from those that are healthy. And the third scenario, basically just isolating the at-risk category from pretty much everybody else. And that's what we see with Trump's plan. Now, the problem that I mentioned in that first podcast episode is up until recently, we really didn't know a ton about the at-risk groups. There was a point in time when we were saying that it's really just the elderly, especially the elderly that smoke. So we're looking at 65-year-old smokers. We've come to recognize that, as I've said in the previous episode, that it's really closer to the age of 50 that you need to be a little bit more concerned. But even still, most people tend to survive in that age group. It's only about those that are 80 or 90, 70, 80, 90 that really have that negative effect from COVID-19, and those with pre-existing conditions. And so, as we go forward, it's important for us to recognize a couple things. One, this doesn't mean that everyone's going to die. We're not entering an apocalyptic situation. This is one of the things I've had a problem with the government. They're trying to emphasize the fact that people needed to stay indoors when we had that total lockdown quarantine. And so they told everyone that they could die from this disease. And it's true to an extent. Everyone could theoretically die from this disease, just like anyone theoretically could die from the flu. No one is going to say you have a 100% chance of always surviving. But at the same time, it's a very, very, very small likelihood that if you're young and healthy, no pre-existing conditions, that you're going to suffer immensely from this disease. In fact, most people, as we've seen from studies in Iceland, Chicago, and other places around the world, are going to be asymptomatic cases, which means that the pool of individuals who have this disease, and are able to fight off this disease with relative ease is extremely large. And so, as we make this transition, you're going to start to see health officials changing their narrative a bit because they want to influence public policy and decisions and actions of individuals within society in a different way. This does not mean that you should be concerned for your life if you're a youth. You're probably going to be okay. In fact, in some cases, you probably have already had it. You probably overcome it. If you're an individual who has these criterias of the at-risk group, you do need to be a little bit worried, and we do see the Trump plan kind of accounting for that. The one thing that I did notice is that it didn't appear to be that there was any regressive gates. You notice that I talked about those gates from moving from one phase to the next phase. It didn't appear to me, from my research into the subject, that there was a regressive gate, meaning that at what point, moving from phase 1 to phase 2, do you say, okay, this is so bad that perhaps we need to move back to phase 1? Maybe we weren't prepared to move to phase 2. I'm assuming that there has to be one. I really do think there has to be one, and I just haven't found it. Or maybe the Trump team just really doesn't want to emphasize that. I don't know. But I would like to assume that there is one, and as soon as we find one, we'll make sure to put it out on our website. But that's something that is a necessary component of any one of these plans, is at what point do you move back from phase 3, for example, to phase 2. And I also just want to say really quickly in regards to a lot of the critical views coming out about this plan from conservatives. Just because we have decided to end this form of lockdown for a lockdown that's less restrictive doesn't mean that the original lockdown was completely useless, right? That's not at all what this plan means, because it really comes down to knowing, did we have the same treatments? Did we have enough ventilators? Did we know enough about the at-risk groups to really be able to nail down the people that should be at home and sheltering? Sweden had the advantage of having to determine what plan they were going to go with much later than most countries. And so in that particular case, they could choose this scenario 3 option, and they could be relatively fine with it because they knew more about what was happening with this disease than, say, for example, China. China, who started out with it rather quickly. I mean, they were going to have to really, really wait and wade through this before they knew what was happening. And so don't take a look back at what has happened and think that it was a complete and total waste, right? We found out that hydroxychloroquine has been rather successful. There's remdesivir. I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, but that's a treatment that's coming out that's pretty useful. We've been creating a ton of ventilators that we can distribute and put out there. And so this wasn't a waste. It was to delay the spread of the disease until we knew more about it. And now that we know more about it, hindsight is 2020, we can make that decision correctly that we need to move into a little bit more of an open economy. And that's something that I agree with. I feel like Trump actually did quite well with this plan. There are some things I would change, as I would change with everything, but I feel like it's quite a good plan. Now, let's get into the part where we're going to touch on some feelings. And this comes from an honest place of concern. I'm not saying that I know more than anyone else. I really am not. I don't want to convey that. But I do feel like the way that a lot of conservatives and a lot of people on the left, namely socialists, have been interacting with this particular situation is one of the most, how do I say this nice? I don't want to say anything mean, right? It's one of the worst PR images I've seen in a long time. I mean, it's really the way in which people interact with this media on this outlet when it comes to the quarantine has been almost idiotic. Almost. I'm not saying you're an idiot if you act in this certain way, but I'm saying that your PR really looks stupid. And we're going to go into that because I know you're not a stupid person. You really aren't. You're a smart person and you care about important things. I'm just saying that what you've been saying could be phrased better. Especially if you're a populist or a social conservative and you've been talking as Rush Limbaugh has, and you share things that say we never needed to flatten the curve. Stuff like that sounds bad, right? We had a article from the Washington Times talking about how old people die. That's what they do. That's not something you want to say. I don't know why anyone would say that. You shouldn't be saying old people die. It's fine if we open the economy and then old people die. You don't want to, I mean, what kind of image are you projecting? This is coming from the group that has traditionally opposed euthanasia. I know for a fact we still oppose abortion. I don't know where we're sitting with euthanasia now. But it's hard for you to say that we never needed to flatten the curve. We can allow old people to die because we don't want to face a Great Depression type recession. I understand that. It's important that we avoid that. But you don't want to phrase it that way. I don't know why you would phrase it that way. Instead of saying, like, we never needed to flatten the curve, I don't know why you wouldn't just say, well, we should flatten the curve in a different way, one that's more sustainable. That's what I've been arguing, right? We know for a fact that the way that we had this prior lockdown was not going to be tenable. People at some point were just going to rebel. It was going to be important for the economy that we open back up again. But I would never say at any point, it's fine if old people die. I don't know why you'd say that. Just say, I understand, necessarily old people are going to die from this, and it's a tragedy. I mean, we see that happen. Dr. Fauci, we see Donald Trump, we see pretty much everybody talking about how every death from this is a tragedy, which they should be saying. Not a necessity, but a tragedy, and an eventuality, right? So when we say we want to open the economy as much as possible and still protect those that are at risk, we still want to flatten the curve, we just want to do it in a different way, that sounds a whole lot more respectful. It sounds almost like it's less cold, almost like it's less calculating, almost like it's less self-centered than this concept of, well, old people are going to die, let's open the economy. And I understand, I'm not saying that anyone who says that we needed to open the economy, we never needed to flatten the curve, is an individual who doesn't care about old people. I'm not saying that you don't love your grandparents. What I'm saying is your methodology in which you've been debating this sounds like it. And you need to consider that. If you want to convince people that we need to take a course of action, the best way to do so is say, I agree. We need to protect your grandparents. We really do. We need to protect those that are at risk. Let's do so in a way in which we can accomplish that protection and also open the economy. And Trump's plan, I feel like, really hits that on the head. It's a great plan. It still is flattening the curve. If you're going to maintain this concept that we never needed to flatten the curve, well, then Trump's plan is still useless because it's designed to flatten the curve. If executed properly, it will. So don't take this tempting dive to move into this thought process of, because trying to protect the elderly's life their lives is just such a financial drain. It's so hard for us to maintain financial stability as a country that we can make that necessary sacrifice. I mean, that's very close to euthanasia, right? Families that can't afford to take care of their elderly grandmother who is going to die soon anyways, arguing that honestly we should allow for them to pass away and die with dignity, right? It's very close. The only difference there being the actual intent, what people are going and actually physically doing themselves. But it's very close, and that's not something that you want to engage in, especially as the pro-life party, right? We don't want to ever throw away a life that could be saved because we also needed the economic output. That sounds really close to what a lot of abortionists, what a lot of euthanasia activists are arguing. I know that's not what you intend, but it's going to come back to bite you. It really will. As somebody who has a lot of experience with debate, this will come back to bite you. So don't take that route. It's not a safe route, and it's not a route that I feel like you honestly believe either. Now, as much as I tend to bag on populists and social conservatives, I feel bad for this next category because I tend to bag on them even more, which is the libertarians. And I tend to be more libertarian myself, right? I'm a pragmatist. It's an invented category that I put right between the libertarians and the social conservatives. I trend towards smaller government. I like smaller government, but I have a tendency to like certain policies that can be advanced by a social conservative that tends to be more authoritarian, right? I fall kind of in between those groups. But despite the fact that I'm a very close cousin of the libertarian philosophy, I can't stand some of the things that they do. And I'm going to preface this, I love you libertarians, you guys are great. I do think you're fighting for something good. My wife is a libertarian, so know that we get along. But when you go out and you say, we don't need the government to tell us to social distance, right? We don't need the government to tell us to do the responsible thing. And then you go to a protest, you go to a rally in which you're not social distancing, not a single person there is wearing a mask, you're sharing food. I mean, honestly, you look like you're defeating your own cause. If your argument is that those citizens are responsible enough in this national security issue to govern themselves and to protect themselves from this invisible enemy, this foreign adversary, as it's been referred to by Donald Trump, then you should be doing everything you can to ensure that. You know, your argument would have a whole lot more strength if when you went to this protest, everybody maintained perfect social distancing. Everybody wore a mask. Everybody was super conscientious and careful about their actions. If you did that, I mean, you would blow people away. You'll notice that a lot of these rallies, the police didn't show up really to arrest anyone. That never happened. They didn't forcibly disperse the crowds. So that what that means is for a lot of these states that are issuing stay-at-home orders, they're not really being enforced by the police presence that you're afraid that it's going to be enforced by. Not in your state at least, or not in that particular case. What you're facing is what some of you refer to as the fake news media. And it's honestly, it's responsible for the news, for the media, to call you out when you say you're responsible enough to social distance without the interference of the government, and then you don't, even when the government is ordering you to. Like, the media should call you out for that because you fundamentally defeated your own argument. So you have to be conscientious. You have to be aware of what your actions are saying about your philosophy, what you claim to be advocating for, and then acting directly against it. It sounds more like you're a 15-year-old complaining about how mom told you to do your homework, but you were going to do your homework anyways. So why would she tell you that? And now you're not going to do it. Like, what? Why are you doing this? You know, it's one thing to say, we can do this ourselves, and then to actually do it. It's another thing to say, we can do this ourselves, and then not to do it. That's an issue, right? And so let's say that I grant you this concept, right? And I say that you are responsible enough to take on this claim yourself. And a lot of you are going to come back and say, well, it's not about responsibility. It's not if I'm responsible enough. It's my rights. Like, okay, I'll grant you that. I'll say this is your right. Your right is to be able to do what you want within regard to these cases. You have certain constitutional rights that shouldn't be infringed by the government. I'm going to grant you this. We'll come back to it. We'll circle back to it when it comes to national security. But right now we're going to say, I grant you this. But in those actions, if in the course of those actions you do something that causes another individual to either be hospitalized or to die, you have a legal liability to pay for that action. If you, for example, are infected with this COVID-19 virus, and then you go out and infect an at-risk category individual who then goes to the hospital because of your action, you should be responsible for their hospital fees. If that person dies, you should be held liable for manslaughter. I mean, that's how we operate. You should be able to do anything you want, wave your hand around in the air as much as you want until you hit somebody in the face. But once you do, you have to be held equitable for that action. It's a fundamental principle of libertarianism. You can't do whatever you want without impunity. That's anarchy. There's a difference between that and libertarianism. Libertarianism means that you have the freedom to do what you want until you adversely affect another individual personally, which, if you have the COVID-19 virus, or the disease, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then you give it to somebody else and they die, and it can be traced to you, and it can be proven in a court of law, you should be held legally liable for that. Now, the government has decided to treat this as almost like an invasion by a foreign adversary, that this is a national security issue, which, if we as conservatives are going to say this is a national security issue, we need to stick by that. Either it is or it isn't. If it's a national security advisor, let us remember that we have cases in which you could have habeas corpus suspended when you have a foreign invasion of the homeland, right? I mean, that's one of the things that can happen in a case in which you have an enemy army that has invaded the continental United States or has invaded U.S. soil. Obviously, that's not something I'm advocating for, but the government has a lot of power. It has a lot of leeway in terms of getting things to happen when it comes to national security issues. So that's something that you need to debate. If this is national security, this is a national security issue, you need to question yourself. To what extent does the government have the authority to force citizens to do certain actions? We know that they have the draft, right? Is that unconstitutional? A lot of you will argue yes, and that's fine. But you need to be open and honest with what your arguments are. And if your argument is that the government doesn't have the right to enforce us to do this, great. Make that argument, and then make the argument that I would be willing to accept legal liability for any of my actions that might cause harm to somebody else. If you do that, I guarantee you will win people over. People might not necessarily want to do what you say, but they will have a lot of respect for what you have said. At least you're willing to do that. What they don't have respect for is when you say, I'm responsible enough to do this myself. I don't believe that there should be any legal liability tied to myself. And I also, by the demonstration of my actions, am not going to do any of the things that I said that I'm responsible enough to do. That doesn't hold water, and it shouldn't. So you've got to make these decisions. You have to make these claims in the correct way, or it's going to come across as though you're just conceited, right? And I know you're not. I know you care about your liberty. You care about everybody else's liberty too, but you have to convey that. Now, let's go to the group that's my favorite to bash. And you guys, honestly, are probably my favorite people to talk with, right? We get along so well. It's the Socialists. I fought so hard and for so long, both in my first podcast episode on Facebook, anytime I talk with conservatives, trying to dissuade them from equating the empty grocery store shelves to a trial run of socialism, because they're not in any way, shape, or form related, right? Panic buying is very different from socialistic policy. In that case, what we have learned is that we need to have this put in with part of our education system, crisis management, teaching people how they ought to operate and prepare for eventual crises. However, when I thought I was doing something to really give a lot of support to socialism, they've turned around now and they've totally claimed this scenario. They've totally claimed the situation. Now all of a sudden, they're willing to cop to this lockdown. I don't understand what's going on. I've seen memes go around talking about how housebroken the American people are because they want to go out back to work so that they can work to make the rich class, the upper class, richer, so that they can work and die to alleviate the concerns of the upper class. Like, what? People are locked in their houses, right? They're stuck in their houses all day, every day. A lot of them are unemployed. No one wants to be in that situation. Why would you talk about how their desire to be free is an inherent evil of capitalism? Who are you winning over? The only people that you can be persuading are yourselves. It's an echo chamber. Like, oh yeah, the people are housebroken. They really are capitalist pigs. I mean, that doesn't convince anyone who wants to go back to work, who wants to get out of their house, who wants to live a life outside of their living room. And so I don't know why you'd want to own this. Don't own this situation. Don't be talking about how, oh, now all of a sudden that we see that people are being provided with the socialist programs now that there's a national emergency. Well, it's a national emergency. These issues aren't designed for long-term viability. We already have economists talking about how if we don't reverse course quickly, we would be at a near Great Depression like recession. That's not something that anyone wants. Why would you cop to this? This is not something you should cop to. If you want to make an argument about how socialist policies could have alleviated a lot of these problems, we'll make that claim. But don't claim that this situation in which we're clearly trying to just survive as a country, as an economy, as a society, is a great example of how socialism works. That doesn't make sense. It might make sense to you, but that's because you have your own confirmation bias, and anything that looks vaguely similar to what you want to enact is going to, of course, be something that you like. But this is not a situation in which we have a long-term viability plan. We're going to see rampant inflation if we don't change things rather quickly. We're going to see an economic collapse if we don't change things rather quickly. If you want to cop to this, then you have to cop to that later on, and it will come back to bite you, and it should, right? And so, as you're sitting there and talking about how, oh, capitalists are suddenly abandoning capitalist policy for these socialist notions, just recognize, one, this is a national security issue. Two, it's not long term. It's not going to last very long before it utterly collapses. And three, when it comes to these kind of situations, anytime that we're trying to protect the lives of American citizens from the adverse effects of other American citizens or foreign adversaries, we're willing to do different things, right? Take a look at jails, right? Healthcare is provided in jails. Food is provided in jails. Housing is provided in jails. Things that you need to survive are provided in jails. I'm not saying socialism is inherently like a jail. I'm saying this situation is. Where in the case that you are completely monitored and controlled in certain aspects by the government, right? You're not allowed to go out and congregate in huge groups of individuals. You're not allowed to go out and work in certain businesses, which is pissing off our libertarian friends, by the way. In these cases, the government does provide a lot of these resources necessary for those people to survive. But in no case is a jail ever self-sufficient. Right? We've never seen a jail create a community that is so well managed and produces everything that it needs that it's able to survive, or even produce enough to trade for profit. Right? These private jails, any public jails, they require funding from the government. So where's the funding going to come from if we're living like we would be living in a jail? We shouldn't be fighting for rent control. We shouldn't be fighting for UBIs just because this situation has proven that we can for a short term, because this situation is going to collapse. Don't use this situation as one of your examples. Use something else as an example, because this is a poorly construed socialist example of what you should be doing. You have a lot better chance of success by eschewing what's happening now, saying it's not socialism, and therefore you won't have to cop to the eventual and possible destruction of the economy coming on later on, right? You don't want to cop to the unemployment right now. You don't want to cop to people being locked in their houses. Don't do it. It's not smart. And so, unless you're willing to cop to all of the adverse effects, don't cop to these benefits, right? Because these benefits are going to lead to adverse effects. So last thing, let's kind of reconcile back together. We need to open the economy, right? I understand from the populist and from the social conservative perspective, we do need to open the economy, but we shouldn't be saying things about how we never needed to flatten the curve, right? Trump's plan is great. It should still flatten the curve, and it helps us to open the economy. That's a good thing. Let's argue that. Let's push forward with this concept that we need to open the economy, and by doing so, if we do it correctly, we will still flatten the curve and will provide people with what they need to survive, right? If you're a libertarian, we should call out government overreach. If people are having a picnic by themselves in a park, clearly no one else is around except their immediate family, and they go and they get ticketed by the police force there, that's a non-COVID related issue. That's a non-security, national security issue. That's a case in which the government has overreached. If people are sitting in their cars listening to a radio sermon and they get ticketed, clear example of government overreach. And you should hammer the government for that. Absolutely hammer them. But when it comes to a national security issue, you either need to be willing to cop to the legal liability for it, or you need to be able to say, hey, I recognize this is national security. The government has expended powers to do these certain things, so long as it's restrained within this very narrow confinement of what is necessary to reduce COVID-19 related deaths, right? And you can be a hawk about that without looking almost hypocritical. And you can also talk about how we have crony capitalism in the system, right? We can talk about how these businesses are completely dependent upon the government. Totally fine to talk about. You can still talk about how if as a socialist, we need to fix these inherent problems within society, especially as it comes to wages and things like that. But I wouldn't use this situation as an example. And personally, because I'm not a socialist, I also wouldn't say that socialism is the answer. But these are things that you need to keep in mind as you go about arguing your points. It will help you to gain a lot more traction, to help convince a lot more people. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully you felt like you've learned a little bit from it. Hopefully it's been something that you enjoyed. Please let us know about your criticisms. Let us know what we got wrong in terms of our philosophy, our ideology. Let us know how we could improve the actual podcast itself. And feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. We really do want to expand this. And we hope that at some point we can give people a platform where they too can have their own podcast, where they can contribute their own articles and get their ideas out there. Thank you for joining us. I'm Andrew Lake, and once again, this is The Critical Conservative.